Kalimera, welcome. Ron Allen here, extending the ministry of West Street Christian Church, continuing with the 11th in a series drawn from the Gospel of Mark, particular passages moving sequentially, but not taking every single passage in the Gospel, considering how it might speak to us in the stay-at-home situation in which we find ourselves today, taking clues from Mark's own use of the story of Jesus, as in the year 70, he retold the story to a community that was not staying at home, quite the opposite. Their homes had been greatly disrupted by the Roman invasion of Jerusalem and destruction of the city. So Mark told this story of Jesus to them with an eye toward helping them get through their situation. Last time I began with the idea of covering two stories, the story of the woman with the flow of blood and the story of the raising of Jairus' daughter, because the story of the woman with the flow of blood is embedded within the story of the raising of Jairus' daughter. And the reason the story of the woman with the hemorrhage is set within the story of Jairus is quite revealing. Now, I talked about the meaning of the story of the woman in its own right last time, but the dimension I would add tonight is that the woman is the paradigm, the model, the example, the representation of the faith that Jairus needs in his situation, which is even more serious than hers. I underscore her as the model because in that culture, as I'm sure you know, women were often devalued and their role in society diminished, certainly prescribed by narrow boundaries. But here is a woman who steps outside the prescriptions of her personal illness, what this may have done to her self-image, how it disrupted her social relationships, and even distracted from the religious participation she would have had in the public gatherings. She stepped outside of all of these cultural values in order to touch the garment of Jesus, because she knew that in him and in what he represents, the realm of God, there is a power that overcomes even the most restrictive cultural boundaries of this old age. She, a woman, not fully an outsider, but certainly on the margins of ancient society, becomes the example, the way that Mark's group, who are themselves living on the margins of society, are to live. They are to be like this woman, to see in Jesus the presence of the realm of God that will transform their situation if they reach out and touch the hem of his garment. So she left that encounter with him restored and empowered. And just by way of reminder, the story of the raising of Jairus' daughter begins with Jairus rushing to Jesus, begging Jesus to come because his little daughter is ill, approaching death. The word little increases the sense of pathos and empathy. It just touches your heart in the deepest places when you see a little one suffering innocently, unable to do anything other than be there and suffer. And she is still alive, when Jairus comes and begs. He begs. How hard it is for me to beg when there is something I want so much that is beyond my power, and that is the only way to get it, to beg. It takes everything I have. So Jairus comes. Jesus agrees to go to Jairus's house. The group moves forward and is interrupted by the woman with the flow of blood. So, as the encounter with the woman with the flow of blood ends, some messengers come from Jairus's house. While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the master any further?" There is a resignation about that statement, because from the perspective of the old age, death is the most powerful instrument that the old age has, its greatest threat. It's the end of possibility. So, overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He has just said of the woman that her belief, her faith, her willingness to do what he said, her willingness to recognize what he represented, is what made it possible for her to be restored. And now she is the example for Jairus. Jesus allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. They are the equivalent of the executive committee of the disciples. And Mark uses them, brings them into the picture sometimes to underscore the teaching that they had, the benefit that they had from him. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people people weeping and wailing loudly. These were professional mourners, and yet even though they were hired, they initiated and facilitated mourning among the others in a very public way that many scholars of pastoral care think was very healthy. The outward expression of the inward emotion at the time of death, clearing it out, as it were, more healthy than the way in which we sometimes repress these emotions and they turn inward and work against us, even causing psychological damage and illnesses. When he had entered the house, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion? The child is not dead, but sleeping." Now, that does not mean the child was not dead. It means that Jesus here uses the language of sleep in a figurative way to speak of death, but in such a way as to anticipate the raising of the child from the dead. Expectation. They had no expectation that something more powerful than death was there. And so they called the mourners. And I have to say, sometimes we in the church fall victim to this way of thinking, this failing to break outside the boundaries of the expectations that we bring to people, to events, and sometimes even to the church itself. you know, how could it be any different? It's just human. But here we have Jesus acting out the reminder that when he is present, and in the church he is always present, our preformed, limited sense of expectations are not always the full potential of a situation. This, of course, pertains to Mark and his church. There were people in the wake, in the destruction of the temple, who were killed, who were dead. Afterwards, there was still a certain amount of violence going on. It was as if something was trying to kill the culture. And within the culture, there is this little tiny church. And it is easy to imagine how they felt deflated, depleted, much as we sometimes feel now, and dead, even dead, like in the sense of, how can there be a future? How can there be a real possibility for us now? And they laughed at him. Oh, yes. We laugh sometimes when people point to boundaries as if they are fixed and can never be crossed. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand. Can you feel that tender gesture? And said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk. She was about 12 years of age. And they were overcome with amazement. The funeral pyre left by the Romans in the temple when they burned the woodwork, dead. Easy to imagine how Mark's community, threatened on so many sides, such a little tiny group over and against such a big empire, fearing not only figurative death, but the possibility of physical death and the end of their mission and all that it represents. To that situation, this story speaks directly that the power of the realm of God represented in the person of Jesus is at work even in and around the death that is so much of their everyday reality. And as long as he is in the room, reaching out, taking their hands, they too can hear this word, "Get up and walk." I need to hear this word. I need to feel this touch. I imagine some of you do too. And here it is, Jesus' word to you and me, even in the face of death. Get up and walk.